So thank you all for coming. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Martin Bunton. I'm a professor of history at UVic and also the chair of the program committee at the Center for Global Studies. It's a real honor for me to fill in for the director, Oliver Schmidtka, today to welcome you all to today's talk. And let me start by acknowledging that although we do meet virtually and on Zoom, many of us, of course, do reside on Indigenous lands, and UVic itself stands on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. The Center for Global Studies has long sort of struggled and discussed, debated what this really means, and certainly series and talks like today's setting dispossession into global context has certainly helped us through these challenges. So I will introduce Andrew Bach, who has put together this wonderful series on dispossession in its global context, and then I'll ask Andrew to introduce our speaker. Andrew is an associate fellow at the Center for Global Studies. He's an instructor in the law school, and he's also an adjunct in the history department. It's been wonderful working with Andrew at the Center for Global Studies for a number of years here. Andrew's larger project is on a global history of dispossession, and he's written on many different aspects of this, but has also put together quite a wonderful resource here for the center. This is, I believe, the third of the series here on Zoom, and there's a whole collection of talks to come. So Andrew, with thanks, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Well, it's particularly wonderful to have the speaker that we've got today. Dr. Caroline Lescheck, for those of you who don't know, is an associate professor and the head of the Department of English at Simon Fraser University. And her research and her writing over the years have been on 19th century literature, but 19th century literature in an extremely engaged way. And what I mean by that is that Caroline works on blending disciplines such as history and politics in with literature to sort of bring to life through literature the lives of the people in the past. And this is absolutely true of her most recent book that was only published a few weeks ago, which is called The Afterlife of Enclosure. And I've been through it. It is a wonderful, wonderful book. And I'll start by probably embarrassing Caroline to say that one of the impacts that I had when I read this book was very similar to the impact I had as an undergraduate when I read E.P. Thompson. And I encourage all of you to seek out her work. And what she'll be looking at today is giving us an overview of the type of approach she's taken. Now, many of you who have attended these talks in the past know that what we're hoping to do is look at the question of dispossession, both in a global sense, but also in an interdisciplinary sense, looking at it from different disciplinary perspectives. And that's why it's wonderful to have somebody like Caroline who can bring to bear a literary approach to the whole question, as well as a historical and a political. And as Martin said, if I could ask all of you to keep both your video and your sound off while Caroline is presenting. And at the end, if you have questions, could you simply turn on your video to alert me to it? And I could ask you then to pose a question at the end of the talk. But without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Caroline Lescheck.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that incredibly lovely introduction and for inviting me to speak today. It's very nice, I have to say, at the end of a big project to have the opportunity to present and reflect on it. So I want to thank you especially for providing that opportunity. Thank you as well to everyone else for coming. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your comments and questions and having the time for a nice long discussion at the end of my talk. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. While the violence of colonial dispossession is ever present, it is particularly so today, with yesterday's discovery of a mass grave containing the remains of 215 Indigenous children on the grounds of a former residential school in Kamloops. So as Martin suggested, thinking about dispossession in global contexts and doing what we can to think and act on this problem is exceedingly urgent. What I would like to do in my talk today is touch on three aspects of my new book. Its overall aims and scope, the specific connections between enclosure, dispossession, and the management of the poor in 19th century Britain, and the particular challenges British realist writers faced in terms of representing enclosure. I will then end with a brief coda of sorts, reflecting on how the work of 19th century novelists can help us imagine new forms of collective life in the midst of a dominant culture intent on establishing the inevitability and morality of individual self-interest and relentlessly working to turn, and here I quote Nick Blomley, a collective interest into an individualized one. In her book on the Paris Commune, Communal Luxury, the Political Imaginary of the Paris Commune, Kristen Ross, following Benjamin, notes that, quote, there are moments when a particular event or struggle enters vividly into the figurability of the present. And this seems to me to be the case with the commune today, end quote. The same, I believe, can be said today about the enclosure of the historical commons in Britain and the responses and resistance to it. Multiple movements and conversations, including Occupy in North America, Indigenous campaigns around the globe centered on decolonization and the return of land, ecological movements grounded in a call to renew a global commons, and discussions of the newly emergent forms of common life and the ever-looming threat of their privatization in the digital realm have brought to the fore a contemporary politics of the commons, as well as critiques of the new forms of enclosure that have accompanied neoliberalism. All of these movements quite powerfully suggest that the commons and its enclosure have an afterlife that extends far beyond the reach of the 19th century and the writers that are the focus of my study, namely Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy. For me, it was the movement from past to present and present to past that brought into view two fundamental thematics that have been neglected or undervalued in literary criticism in recent decades. On the one hand, the connections between depictions of the common, the ordinary common characters, the commonplace events, and the seemingly unremarkable mise en scène of everyday life that are the lifeblood of realism, and the historical existence of the literal commons, those shared lands that were once a defining feature of the British landscape and British imaginary. On the other hand, what was also revealed was the enduring presence within 19th century realism and 19th century culture of utopian energies, which both hark back to the commons and point forward to a transformed society. So in the broadest strokes over the course of the book, I locate within the 19th century's most canonical writers a series of figurations of the common in the wake of the destruction of the physical or literal commons, and argue that each of these writers in their very different styles endow both the historical trauma that was enclosure and the utopian spirit that the commons embodied with an afterlife. And just to give but one brief example of how varied these writers' styles and idioms are, Terry Eagleton, in his own inimitable style, sets George Eliot in sharp contrast to Dickens, commenting that if in Dickens, quote, you cannot be virtuous and have greasy skin, in Eliot, nobody is either transcendently good or wicked beyond redemption. 19th century writers, I suggest, were uniquely positioned to narrate this history. In Think Like a Commoner, David Bollier notes that, quote, one of the most insidious things about enclosures is how they eradicate the culture of commons and our memory of them. The impersonal, individualistic, transactional-based ethic of the market becomes the new normal. But for 19th century writers, enclosures had not yet fully rendered the history of the commons invisible. At the same time, however, poised as they were on the cusp of a full-scale commodity culture, realist writers also recognized that carrying this history forward would necessarily entail inventing a new culture of commons rather than recovering the lost commons. In other words, their respective attempts are far from nostalgic. Instead, they envision future forms of communal life and future forms of typical character, or common characters that draw on notions of type. And I can certainly say more about this in the Q&A, that gesture toward a life world freed from the tenets of private property and the various forms of dispossession concomitant with privatization and market dependence. Dickens is illustrative in this regard, given his identification with the city. While he may look like the outlier among my three writers, his creation of an urban commons, as I argue, presciently anticipates current demands to commonize the city. I call what these writers are doing ongoing thought experiments in order to stress the incomplete nature of these novelistic projects, the fact that these experiments extend across the many novels in each of the writers' oeuvres, and finally, that these experiments can only be fully realized in the world itself. I also use this term to frame the formidable representational demands or challenges that enclosure poses, given the nature of it as an event. The historical processes of enclosure involve at once a series of parliamentary acts, local actions, and far more amorphous events that have occurred over many centuries. As a result, even the seemingly simple act of dating enclosure proves difficult. Enclosure continues, without a signal moment when enclosure can be said to have begun, and with no endpoint, enclosure continues apace today. Enclosure's time frame threatens conventional modes of telling history and storytelling. Moreover, the effects of this process are multiple, varied, and often deferred and diffuse, marked only tenuously by their connection to the initial event that induced them. Therefore, as an event, enclosure defies our common sense understandings of a historical event as discrete, locatable, and temporally bounded. It is here that the work of Rob Nixon is central to my thinking. In Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, Nixon sees in contemporary environmental disasters and climate change a similar problematic. Such events are attritional catastrophes that perpetrate a slow violence. In the context of enclosure, this problematic is articulated in the attentiveness British realism accords to the constitutive violence of capitalism and the processes of primitive accumulation that drove enclosure. Slow rather than spectacular, this form of violence constitutes the world as we know it. Wending its way through the ubiquity of the everyday, it makes itself known in the least conspicuous of manners. The workaday world, the seemingly natural hedgerow, the constitution of ourselves as individuals, the weather. The question then is how to capture the historical process of enclosure without doing damage to its non-evental aspects or slow violence perpetrated over the course of multiple centuries, but not visible in any simple, transparent way. And here, I just want to be clear, this is certainly not to say that there are not also acts of spectacular or evental violence that erupt within or interrupt the day-to-day constitutive violence of capitalist existence. But it is to say that the violence of dispossession in the form of slavery, settler colonialism, and capitalism, which comes in its wake, is so pervasive as to seem like second nature. So much so, indeed, that Christina Sharp, in her recent book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, likens this second nature to the weather. Quote, in my text, the weather is the totality of our environments. The weather is the total climate, and that climate is anti-Black. Tying the weather to the slave ships coming and going from places as far afield as St. Louis and Senegambia, Havana, Rio, and London, and the, quote, 500 years of voyages of theft, pillage, and bondage, end quote. Sharp works to expose slavery not as a singular event, but rather, and this is a quote again, a singularity, a weather event or phenomena likely to occur around a particular time or date or set of circumstances. Again, she underscores, in what I am calling the weather, anti-Blackness is as pervasive as climate. I would say here too that throughout my discussion of enclosure, I draw on a number of theorists, old and new, whose ideas have profoundly shaped and influenced my thinking. A very abbreviated list, very, very abbreviated, would include the following. Peter Linebaugh and a few of his thoughts and insights in particular. One, the notion of what he calls bottom-up history, which, drawing on Shakespeare's Bottom the Weaver, entails for him attending, quote, not to the completeness of the wall, but to the chinks in it, end quote. For Linebaugh, as a social historian, the chinks in the wall are to be found by documenting those voices previously left out of history, work begun by the History Workshop in the late 1960s, when its founder, New Left historian Raphael Samuel, walked the countryside around Oxford, talking to elderly residents about their experiences of class struggle in 19th century Oxfordshire. For me, as a literary scholar, the question became, what approach then might a bottom-up literary history take in the absence of such voices? In some sense, the answer was that history was, in fact, in plain sight, in the stories and figures of the common and commoners that are at the heart of 19th century British realism. Linebaugh's second crucial insight for me is his powerful claim that the lived experience of the commons constituted nothing short of an alternative epistemology, a, quote, different ecology dependent on the unenclosed, end quote. An epistemology that I trace from the poet John Clare, who equates enclosure, the lawless law is one of his terms, with the destruction of the rights of freedom, or what the critic Jonathan Bate beautifully characterizes as the right to roam. to Hardy, who envisions in his writing a wayward, unenclosed self, free from the enclosures of a landscape, both social and geographical, that deforms and destroys the land and its inhabitants. Finally, Linebaugh reminds us that land rights and common rights have historically been connected to political rights. In the Magna Carta Manifesto, he stresses that two charters made up Magna Carta. The charter we all know, establishing juridical and individual political rights, and the Charter of the Forest, guaranteeing the right to commoning, recovered in 1217, which in turn recognized subsistence rights. For example, the right to widows' estivers, wood needed for housing, repairs, implements, and so on, and to subsistence usufructs, the temporary use of another person's land. Against the prevailing tendency to see commoning provisions as out of date, Linebaugh insists that they are more relevant than ever in the current neoliberal era. Silvia Federici's writings on the commons and the social function it played specifically for women are equally significant for my analysis. One particular claim of hers guides my thinking throughout the book. This is a quote from her. "No common is possible unless we refuse to base our life and our reproduction on the suffering of others, unless we refuse to see ourselves as separate from them," end quote. As I argue, Dickens, Eliot, and Hardy all share a vision or version as well of this ethic, each reinforcing the ineluctably collective nature of social life in their own unique manner. To give but one example here, the use of common characters and types in their work presupposes a collective subjectivity. It is only by capturing what is typical or common, what is shared by others, that a type makes sense. Moreover, as I argue, the logic of the commons, as Federici outlines it here, implies a global reach, articulated to varying degrees by each writer, and lays the ground for a vision of universal equality. Her analysis, along with that of J.M. Neeson, underscores how common right protected laborers from wage dependence, granting them a significant independence from compulsory labor and its attendant structures of time, leisure, value, community, consumption, and property relations. This loss of autonomy and this is her term, the web of cooperative relations that the commons embodied, hit women especially hard and led to the gendered division between productive and reproductive labor as the economy moved from a subsistence-oriented to a market-oriented economy. Finally, last but hardly least, Marx's work in Capital on primitive accumulation not only provides a history of the longue durée of enclosure from the 15th to the 19th centuries, but also explicitly and powerfully links the expropriation of land and the expropriation of people, tying rural laborers and urban workers to one another and making clear that enclosure and industrial revolution go hand in hand. He also importantly highlights the role of the state advance made in the 18th century insofar as, quote, the law itself becomes now the instrument of the theft of the people's land. The parliamentary form of the robbery is that of bills for enclosure of commons. In other words, decrees by which the landlords grant themselves the people's land as private property, decrees of expropriation of the people, end quote. Acts or bills for enclosure continue throughout the 19th century and make their way into 19th century realism, both directly and indirectly. For example, the battle between the poisers tenant farmers in Eliot's Adam Bede, and the squire, the landlord of their estate, functions as a microcosm for the historical process of enclosure, with the violence the squire threatens displaced onto the poiser's dairymaid, Hetty Sorrel, who is wooed and impregnated by the squire's son, himself a proud proponent of enclosure, and who barely escapes being put to death for infanticide. Although the poisers are ultimately spared the loss of land and livelihood, the violence the squire threatens, reenacting the violence of enclosure in miniature and thereby focusing and personalizing its impact, nonetheless is made good in displaced form in Hetty Sorrel's fate. Now, advocates of enclosure certainly mounted their own case to support the destruction of the commons. At the center of these accounts were the intertwined issues of private property, fears of overpopulation, and the management of the poor. The influence of John Locke in these debates is inestimable. His labor theory of property defines open or undeveloped land as empty, terra nullius, and establishes property as a natural right. Once conceived of as empty or unowned, land is made available for individual cultivation and ownership. What, quote, man improves becomes his property for Locke. Once perceived as unowned, in need of cultivation or ripe for more efficient methods of production as an unused or underused resource, the commons is essentially there for the taking, a vision that justifies and sustains not only the enclosures of the 19th century countryside, but European colonial and imperial projects more generally. And I would add here, for those of us at Laura Brace's talk last month on the rationale slaveholders used to justify slavery in the West Indies and elsewhere in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, this language of improvement will be familiar. I won't go into the pernicious details of Locke's argument here. Suffice it to say that he was wrong on many counts. He assumes there is always enough land to go around. He willfully ignores the common rights of those already on the land, be those lands held by English commoners or indigenous peoples, and he sees all of nature as a potential resource to be privately owned. Despite Locke's assurances that the common good was not in danger and that there was enough land and resources to go around, later accounts in support of enclosure whip up the diametrically opposed fear that overpopulation will deplete the land and resources, and also rely on the benefits of private property to make their case. Bolstered by Malthusian claims, this line of argument targets the inefficiency of the open field system and common rights and raises the specter of overuse of commonly held resources as opposed to land held in private hands, which in turn will lead to the utter depletion of resources and the inability to feed a growing population. Well, within such a calculus, the poor suffer the most, while the rich have access to what Malthus called preventive checks to population, such as birth control. The overpopulated poor are at the mercy of what he calls positive checks, namely war, disease, and most prominently famine, to keep their numbers down. This line of reasoning, in turn, had a direct impact on thinking about the English Poor Laws, for part of this argument involved the belief that keeping the poor alive through poor relief only exacerbated the problem of a surplus or surfeit of poor people. Fittingly, Charles Dickens connected overpopulation and the Poor Laws in an introductory comment by Ebenezer Scrooge, refusing to contribute to, quote, a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth, and invoking the presence of workhouses for those in need. In the opening of A Christmas Carol, Scrooge retorts, quote, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. These issues concerning the poor, private property, and fears of overpopulation all come together in the context of enclosure and the processes of primitive accumulation. The means by which they fuel attacks on the commons is perhaps most powerfully and explicitly connected in the British economic writer William Foster Lloyd's 2 lectures on the checks to population, published in 1833. Following in the footsteps of Locke and Malthus, Lloyd raises the specter of the overuse of the commons, which in his account and those of others naturally leads to what the ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968 famously called the tragedy of the commons, namely the inevitable depletion of the commons by common rights and common use. Very much still with us, the power of this narrative cannot be overestimated. Relying as it does on a view of the commons as unmanaged and hence in danger of overuse, Lloyd's, and in his wake, Hardin's analysis at once misrepresent how the commons functioned and use their specious claims about it to once again justify in Lockean fashion the benefits of private property. But neither in the past nor in our own present has this been the only narrative of the commons. And here I want to provide some very brief thumbnail sketches of the alternative figurations of the commons that Dickens, Eliot, and Hardy offer us. With his teeming cast of characters, Dickens creates what I call 19th century collective biographies, which unsettle the very meaning of an individual life and imagine a transformed world in which the remarkable, embodied in his rich catalog of minor eccentric characters, would be common and the common remarkable. Twinning critique and utopian optimism, his novels insist that the production of the commons is always a collective enterprise in the making, which would remake not only the world, but the people in it too. Eliot renders our collective life through the metaphorics of indebtedness to others that encompass nothing less than the commonwealth of all. Crucially, though, as the narrative of enclosure at the center of Adam Bede demonstrates, our indebtedness to others is subtended by property relations, such that any vision of equivalence remains at worst ideological and at best utopian within capitalism. And finally, Hardy brings the global commons home, as it were, by conceiving even the most private details and intricacies of daily life as an intimate part of a far larger process unfolding across the globe in the 19th century, poignantly described as, quote, the great web of human doings then weaving in both hemispheres from the White Sea to Cape Horn, end quote, as he writes in The Woodlanders. Notebooks with clippings from his local Dorset County Chronicle also illuminate with heightened clarity Hardy's abiding concern with precarious forms of life and work as they are embodied in the recurrent themes of wandering and itinerancy and their relationship to the loss of the commons. With their insistence on the dialectical relationship between everyday reality and the economic underpinnings of that reality, realist writers look back with a clear eye and see in the disappearance of the agrarian commons a series of profound transformations, both in the land and in the myriad social, political, and economic relations attendant on the land. They see the loss for what it is. But rather than creating nostalgic narratives about irrevocable loss or attempting to resurrect a bygone era, they turn to the future and conjure new relations that neither forego nor forget the premises or promise of the commons and its communal relations. In short, the longue durée of enclosure and the drive to validate and naturalize privatization tout court, whether in the literal form of private property or the values accompanying it, has gone hand in hand with a longue durée of resistance to enclosure, a fierce and ongoing resistance that can get lost in evental histories and histories that focus on the victors. To be sure, historians of enclosure and the commons have brought this history of resistance to the fore and argued for its ongoing endurance today. What has gone less remarked upon is that 19th century realism played a part in this bottom-up history, and that its role is particularly significant now, given the dearth of forms and narratives with the capacity not only to represent our current moment, but also to inspire resistance to it. In essence, to evoke a desirable common future and engender a desire for that future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. That was just wonderful. That was wonderful. Can I open it up for questions? If anybody would like to. Do we have any questions? Or, as is traditional at these events, do we rely upon the chair to ask the first question? Oh, no, I have a question from Clint Burnham.
Oh, my colleague, no less.
Hey, Caroline, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Nice to see you, Clint.
Nice to see you as well, Caroline. I just ordered your book, but I also scooped it up offline just to take a look. I was looking up the footnote about usufruct, but that's another conversation about jouissance and enjoyment. But I was struck by I really liked the point when you were talking about Dickens very quickly, and you're talking about these little minor characters, the types. And it made me think of Jameson talking about the oddballs, about utopia as a collection of neurotics and so on. So I wonder what the agency is, or what the politics are of that kind of collectivity that Dickens sort of in his monstrously huge novels, his cast of characters. What figuration I think you used the phrase alternative figuration. What kind of collective politics you want to read in there?
Great question. Thanks so much. And yeah, I think there is that sense of the collection of, for him, not so much oddballs per se, but certainly eccentrics. And one of the things I note in that chapter is that Henry James, who took great offense at the way in which he said Dickens reconciles us to the common, also felt like Dickens's novels were this kind of museum of eccentrics. And for him, a community of eccentrics, as he put it, is impossible. And I'm arguing directly against that in the sense of seeing in Dickens a politics, an urban politics that is both about recognizing commonness and our embeddedness in the world, but also recognizing the multiplication of differences. So rather than this notion that is so often the case when people think of types or the common as a reductive sameness, Dickens is, for me, showing exactly the opposite, and that his novels essentially are all about excess and multiplication, and more characters, right? And that sort of teeming urban world. So for me, the politics is a politics of the commons that isn't about a kind of reductive or dull sameness in that way. Yeah. I can say, yeah, I'll let other people ask. I can add some other things later if need be. Okay. Thanks.
Abigail.
Yes, thank you very much. What a fascinating talk, and I'm very keen to read your book. I am also interested actually in, well, I'm interested in this idea that you just introduced in your answer to the last question, which is the tension between discussions of the commons and sameness. And the reason I'm interested in it, I was actually going to ask you a question about the collectivism that was so apparent in all of the political theory and philosophy literature in Britain coming after John Stuart Mill, that there was this just flowering of discussion of socialism and collectivism, and a lot of that literature was not about the commons, to my knowledge, and so I'm very interested in those theorists who talk about collectivism in tension with sameness, or commons in tension with sameness. You've talked about Dickens. Is there anything else that you can comment on in this era that really brings those themes to the fore?
Well, I think those themes are brought to the fore in all of the writers that I look at, for sure. Right. Yeah, so for starters, right? I think for all of them, there's this real, like, part of the problem at the heart of the novels, and maybe just at the heart of 19th century realist writing, right, is the tension between the individual and the collective, or what I like to call, following Frederick Jameson, is this tension between lived experience and structure. And they want, right, I see them, these novelists, wanting to write about both simultaneously, or to show, right, in a dialectical fashion, how the individual is determined and produced by the collective, and vice versa. So for me, that's more, it's not that obviously that they solve it, but that's a sort of problematic at the core of 19th century realism, right? Which is why they so often, as I sort of mentioned, talk about an attentiveness to everyday detail, and to think about how that can be linked to these larger collectivities. And in terms of other people, are you asking more about historians or other philosophy? Can you say a little bit more? And yeah, you might know more about this than I do.
Well, I mean, it's really fascinating, because I don't know more about it than you do, I think. But I think that from what I'm hearing, from what you're saying, is that, you know, there could be a lot of people talking about organicism and holism and collectivism in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, but they are not talking about commons. Right. They're not talking about the commons. And what I'm curious about is whether those who do talk about the commons have that other element that you are talking about here, which is, it's not about sameness. It's not about giving yourself over to a kind of a collective organic whole. It's not at all about that, because that's not what the commons was. It retained a kind of pluralism to it. And it's that I find fascinating, in your description of your work and in your description of Dickens, and you know, I mean, so yeah, maybe this is a question for a follow-up email when I've had, I mean, seriously, because it's just, I think this is a very fascinating point from what I've heard from your talk just now.
Great. Hey, thanks. So, I mean, one thing I would say, one of the people that's been really interesting for me, I mean, one of the things I just more generally that I love about being at the end of a project is thinking about all the things I've learned that I didn't know that much about going in, or people that I've just fell in love with that I didn't know I would. And just as an aside, so in my first book, that person was William Morris. So there's some through lines here, but I think also in terms of that vision you're talking about, a really interesting person is William Cobbett. And in sort of from 1821 to about 26, he rode around the countryside, looking at agriculture and, you know, commenting on what he saw happening in terms of the changes in the landscape. And he's really great, I think, in terms of, one, recognizing the kind of uniformity that and this sort of leveling in a very negative way that Enclosures was all about, and also appreciating the logic of Enclosures and the different forms of resistance to it. So he's definitely talking about the commons specifically. And he, again, sort of in line of this, the example of the language of improvements, he actually talks about enclosure as the rage for improvements, and the ways in which that essentially destroys difference. So maybe hopefully that helps a bit. And yes, I would love an email.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Can I call upon Stephen? Stephen?
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Caroline. It
It's
was
an
a wonderful
FFU party.
Yeah, sorry. That was a wonderful talk, and I think this is such a great book and an important book, and really appreciate it. And just I'm glad you mentioned William Morris, because I was going to say in response to the last comment, he does talk about the commons a little bit, and in the context of collectivism, especially around the attempted enclosure of Epping Forest. Of course, he grew up right beside, and you know, at that point, it's more of a leisure situation. You know, like, let's preserve this because it's aesthetically beautiful, and people can come enjoy the beauty and be ennobled by that sort of thing. But he does talk about it, or read about it. But yeah, my question is I was really struck by your comment on Hardy and itinerancy and wandering. And I've been thinking a lot about Wordsworth recently, and the public road as the place where one encounters the dispossessed, you know, the beggars and the peddlers and the discharged soldiers, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's one of the sort of key points where you find the commons in Wordsworth. You know, the discharged soldier, he encounters him and then leads him across the common land to a hut he can stay at, for instance. So I'm just curious if the public road is a noticeable figuration of the common in any of these novels. Do you think that's another point in which one can see some aspect of the common, whether, you know, negatively perhaps through dispossession and encounters in the public road? Thanks.
Thanks for that. Yeah. Yes, for sure in Hardy, as you're saying. And I think that, first of all, just to say, and this is again from Rob Nixon, and my sort of seeing this move in Hardy novels from tenancy to itinerancy, that I also, the sort of linked term for me is the notion of all of his characters, not all, but a lot of his characters, right, being attritional catastrophes. right? That they, so many of the narratives are around losing a lifeholder lease, becoming houseless and landless, and then wandering, right? And so this kind of combination of the pedestrian, because there's so much walking in the novels, and the itinerant. And he, in some ways, very explicitly brings together that group of the dispossessed. You know, he has an image of this place, Mixon Lane, which is essentially a catalog of all of the same kinds of figures that more recently the Midnight Notes Collective lists as the characters of dispossession, from the vagabond, right, to the poor, to the, you know, all these wanderers. And so on the one hand, I think he sees the closing down of the public road. So it is both a space, it is a space of the dispossessed. It's also a space that seems sometimes to hold out opportunity. But one of the things that I think he does so powerfully, for instance, in Jude the Obscure, is that, right, Jude and Sue are walking all the time, and they're trying to get somewhere where they could live a life, right, undeformed by all the social and geographical pressures that are killing them. And in essence, by the end of the novel, they've been excluded from every place they had once gone or walked. So I think it's pretty grim on that end of things, just in terms of the fact that even the public road, right, is becoming unpassable and unwanderable. And those figures have to be scooped up in some way and punished. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
I see Rod.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. This is a bit of a change of pace, I think, but I'd be interested if you have any thoughts. I've been looking at the question of enclosures in cyberspace and thinking about the issue of privacy and the concerns about loss of privacy and surveillance capitalism and so on. And thinking about the micro enclosures. If you think of privacy, we are trying to create enclosure at the micro level. We have, maybe even at the household level, we want to see the notion of perhaps private property, certainly boundaries as to what we are forced to share. So thinking about your comment, which I think is really very interesting, that we're looking not at events, individual events, but a trajectory of indiscernible micro steps. But at some point, we do want some kind of enclosure around ourselves. And I suppose then you get into the mistakes that we've made in extending that notion of person and personal space to corporate persons and all the problems to which that gives rise. But anyway, I guess I'm asking really for your thoughts about how far out do we push those boundaries, and what does the literature that you're looking at say about this notion of personal space?
Right. Thank you for that. I mean, the quick, crude version is that we have to protect ourselves from the public life through these enclaves, right? Whether it's privacy or the family or, right, these other kinds of social units that somehow seem to protect us. right, from the vagaries of the collective. And so part of me would say that is necessary because of right, the logic of fully unfolded capitalism, and that we need to rethink privacy, or would need to, within a very, in a different, more communally oriented social space. And I think that one of the things that the novelists in the 19th century show very potently is that the private so often goes along with notions of possession and property, right? And again, Hardy is really, really powerful this way, I think, and just showing the destruction that comes from that kind of possessiveness. And so I think that they do gesture toward what I have called an unenclosed self, that wouldn't need the protections of those enclaves or private spaces, and that, right, that it's a misnomer to think they're ever separate in the first place. It's just that they're, both of them are damaging and not particularly life affirming within our current system. So it's a sort of thinking beyond the limits of our current thinking, I guess would be how I would put it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I add, I just thought I'd add one other thing. So for me too, that's part of the intervention for people who aren't in literary studies, which I know many of you aren't, is the idea that 19th century realism was about the consolidation of the individual, right? And that progress was moving from types in literature to individuals with deep psychologies and so on. And so for me, that reproduces the idea that, right, and we can see it within colonial relations, that collective organization is more primitive than individualistic private property. And I think that same assumption has been made about the move from earlier literatures to 19th century realism, and that somehow, right, it's a given that it's better to have a fully developed individualism than to imagine oneself, right, in a much more humble collective space where you don't stand out as anything particularly exceptional. And a favorite phrase of mine from George Eliot is a kind of celebration of the superlatively middling. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Nick.
Hello, Caroline. It's kind of ironic that I have to go all the way to Victoria to meet my SFU colleagues, but and it's lovely to learn more about your work. I'm going to have to read your book, and thank you for the work you put into that and to this this presentation. You can completely disregard my question if it's completely out of your bailiwick, and but I was interested in your longue durée analysis, and of course, if we think about the longue durée of English enclosure, then I think we'd also be thinking about early enclosure, in particular sort of late 16th, early 17th century enclosure, which is, I've always been interested in that moment. I think it's when enclosure sort of begins to form in the consciousness in a way that I'm imagining for Dickens. I mean, there's almost maybe a nostalgia for this process. Can we see, poets, writers, artists engaging with enclosure at that time? Shakespeare and others, I don't know. I mean, I know we can see it in other fields, pamphlets and so on, but if that's outside your area of expertise, then please forgive me.
It's a great question. I would say I'm hoping, given that, if my logic is correct, the answer would be yes. But to point to anything directly, not so much at this particular moment. Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things from the 19th century is they do look back to that particular moment. So the first entry in Thomas Hardy's Facts Notebook is about Kett's Rebellion. There's also mention of the process of enclosure involving the enclosing of lands that were thought to have resources, right, like fossil fuels and so on. So yeah, oh, here we go. Clint Burnham says Christopher Hill on Milton. There you go. Yeah, and I was gonna say Christopher Hill's probably the person who would have the, yeah, thank you, Clint. But thanks for the question. And thanks, as you can see from my quoting you at the beginning, your work has been very, very helpful and great for me to read. So thank you for that.
Perhaps I could ask a question myself, and I ask this on behalf of all of those of us at this meeting who are not in literary studies. Are there 19th century authors out there that you could identify who are clear-cut apologists for enclosure and dispossession?
Well, I don't know about apologists, but one person who would be very interesting to think about would be Trollope, and some of the politics of his novels, because in a way, and you know, some of this is just about the milieu that he writes about and his perspective, but he certainly has more, I would say, more nostalgia for, not for the loss of the commons, but for the loss of a world, of certain kinds of hierarchies that go along with, you know, with a kind of elitism, and that the commons wouldn't necessarily be the most appealing idea for him. And yeah, he would be one person I'd look to. But I think one of the things as well, which is important for me, is to say, and this comes up especially with Dickens, for instance, is to keep separate authors' politics and the politics within their novels. So I think that it can be not helpful to say, oh, you know, because Dickens held some very unappealing views on many, many topics in his moment, to say that things can happen in a novel, right? A kind of politics can emerge that is very different from a writer's stated politics. So it would be more about looking at, well, there could be disconnects between those or not, but that I'd be more interested, yeah, in what's going on in the text, rather than in what people say about their political views outside the text. But yeah, no one is clearly coming to mind for me who's like literally sort of mounting a defense for dispossession, that at least right now, but I will think about that more. It's a very good question. Thanks.
Sure. Do we have any other questions out there? We do. We have Dana.
Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm not from SFU. I'm a MA student at Trinity Western University in Langley. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you so much, Dr. Lesjak. This is so fascinating to me. One of my questions is, you mentioned about the enclosures being a slow sort of environmental disaster, which I would have to agree with that. I think that's very true. When you talk about women and reproduction and production within this context where the women are within the enclosure system and losing the common and the collective in their life and moving into the factories where the factory is just another system of enclosure,
Yeah.
How does that affect the production and reproduction of women and how they become mothers? Like, how did that sort of translate into society as a whole? And I was thinking of it a lot. I don't know if you've read Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, but Marion Earl, the working class, the laboring mother who is dispossessed, and you were talking earlier about the closing down even of public roads where she has nowhere to go. So she's sort of one of those women caught in the production dilemma. Are there, I was wondering if you could expand on that, but I was also wondering if you can recommend any real novels that touch on that sort of a character, because Browning's poem doesn't get into it deep enough, because we're almost left with Marion Earl, but we want more of her. We want to understand her a bit more, because she's essentially saved by a middle-class woman. You know, she's rescued.
Right.
So that's sort of, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much. I think that, yeah, the process, and again, I do think Federici is really good on this, and her book Caliban and the Witch goes back to a very early period to trace out how this impacts women. And I think, right, as she underscores, the idea that having that little bit of ability to resist wage dependence, right? So just the core of the commons in this notion of subsistence rights, that when both men and women lose that, it's devastating in terms of the impossibility, right, of not being brought into the market wage dependent relation, right? And Marx has a great term for that called the silent compulsion of economic relations, right? And how those work. And that too, I think for me is another way of thinking about the notion of this kind of constitutive violence as pervasive, as second nature, but not visible. But for women in particular, and again, most of this, I have to give the credit to Federici. What it means is, one, the kind of division between productive and reproductive labor, and the idea that reproductive labor is not as valuable as productive labor, right, which is still with us today, brought to the fore once again during the pandemic, and the idea that they are then also subject to all sorts of other forms of subjugation, from sexism, right, and inequality in relationships. And again, it doesn't all sort of come in one moment with the loss of the commons, but it sets in place a value system that is devastating for women. And there are lots of good books that have representations of women in factories. Elizabeth Gaskell is really great on this, right? North and South, and Mary Barton. And I quite like as well, it's not as quite as direct a relationship as the one you're asking for, but Ruth is very powerful. And just as I'm saying that, she's also another wanderer, right, gets pregnant out of wedlock, is left wandering, and then subject to, right, all sorts of social pressure around her sin. Yeah, so you either see women just losing that little bit of ability to subsist outside the system, and the fact that lots and lots of women were then transported directly into the mills and factories, and were just brutalized in that system. And I'd say Dickens is really good on that too, in terms of something like Little Dorrit, or just the idea that around every corner is the prison. So if you don't sort of fall in line, you know what your fate is going to be. And as I mentioned too, just with the poor laws, I mean, they really did want to make it so unpleasant to have to get relief, that it would be better if you would just die. Right, that was kind of the laws became increasingly stringent, so as to prevent people from even wanting to take advantage of poor relief. And again, you can just see, right, these are narratives that are still so with us in terms of attitudes toward the poor and to women, the women who are poor in particular. So I hope that helped a little bit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. And it also sort of trickles into your, when you were talking about the surplus of the poor. So almost like the poor reproducing is this negative, there's a paradox where the ruling class needs the poor, but they don't want too much of the poor. And this sort of falls onto the shoulders of women who become responsible for creating the labor, but don't create too much of it in almost in a way that we saw in China with the one baby rules and stuff like that, in a way where, I just find it
and I mean, just as you say that, just also the fact that, right, the system needs the labor, but it's uncompensated, and so, right, that all gets put into place over the course of this duration of changes in the commons and brought in the wake of enclosure, right? Is that it just becomes unrecognized as social labor, and exploited beyond belief. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Are there other questions out there? Well, as we're getting on, we're already at 2 o'clock. Hold on. Does Martin Bunton have a question?
I was wondering if you're about to wind things down.
I was thinking about it.
But no, I don't. No, I just wanted to say some thank yous.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I was thinking of winding it down. It's been a fabulous session. I mean, it was a great paper. There were some great questions there. And the thing that's been running through my mind is, as I've been teaching both law students and history students, and one tries to reach them on all sorts of levels, but I've got to confess that literature hasn't been part of my armory. But one can see that, by golly, there's an argument for that. I mean, I think that your paper was just a brilliant examination of why interdisciplinarity is really good and really revealing. Before I turn it over to Martin, I would just turn to everybody still on the screen and say, The Afterlife of Enclosure by Stanford University Press is very easy, at the click of a button, and you too can have one. And I would encourage you to get as much benefit out of it as I did. But I'll pass now over to Martin to wrap up.
Okay. Well, let me echo that. I'm going to go purchase it. So some thank yous. Caroline, first of all, to you, what an incredible and wonderful talk. I've been busy writing notes the whole time. And as Andrew said, too, just on so many levels, whether it be 19th century Britain or my own work in, I look at early 20th century colonial land regimes, as Rod said, our present and our future. I mean, there's this, it's so rich on many levels. And I've certainly pushed Hardy up on my summer reading list. So I look forward to, and I'll probably read it completely with completely different eyes too. So, and to Andrew, thank you so much for bringing us together virtually like this. You've just taken such a wonderful opportunity of what a virtual gathering can offer us. But I can't help but think too, right, in the post-COVID age that we're all looking forward to, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could gather for a workshop or something of that sort, host something larger here at UVic, and thirdly, then, in terms of that gathering and the convening capacity, to thank so much the Center for Global Studies, Oliver, its director, Stephanie and Jody, and all that the center has offered in terms of its support for the logistics of bringing us all together too. So very much look forward to the next time we can all gather. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all of you for attending too.
Thank you. Thank you very much.